Good. I'm Len Sachs, colleague of Graham's, Graham Wright's, and director of the Cohen Center, also a faculty member here at Heller. This is an event, part of the Heller 65th celebration year, but it's also in the spirit of cooperation and collaboration that has started at Brandeis, if not in other places, a bit of collaboration across usual lines, the Cohen Center and Heller in co-sponsoring this, and in the diversity of the faculty who will be commenting on Graham's work. So that's exciting. So nearly 20 years ago, a long-haired musician who had just graduated college with degrees in music and philosophy arrived at my door. He said he was interested in math. The Cohen Center needed quants, so we hired him. And the rest is history. I've had the privilege of watching Graham evolve and serving as his collaborator on dozens of projects. Over our time working together, he got married, he gained 2 children, and by the way, he earned a PhD here at Heller. He's the full package, a conceptual thinker with a specialty in politics. I'll call him a quantitative genius. He's a lucid writer, and I've co-taught with him a number of times. He's a superb teacher with a passion for social justice. Now, he's also distinguished by luck, or perhaps perspicacity. Just as the November election brought us a leader with a narrow vision who has widened the chasm between how Americans view one another, Graham published a book just came out about at the election time that argued for a very different perspective. He taught us that, yes, it's easy to engage with people we like, not so easy to engage with people whom we hate. But nevertheless, democracy demands that we engage with both. He's got lots of ideas about how we do so. Tonight, I can't help but think that down south in Washington, D.C. land, there are a flurry of new EOs being shot out at the rest of the country. And while that's happening, we're going to talk a different talk about how we talk with one another and perhaps how we repair the torn fabric of our democracy. Seems to me couldn't be a more important discussion at a more important time, and we couldn't have a better group of scholars to have that conversation with us. The way it's going to work is that to lead off, Graham's going to make some remarks that extend the arguments of the book and how we can find a way to engage productively with one another. I'll then ask 3 of our colleagues, Lisa Lynch and Jody Gittell from Heller and Jaffe Lenowitz from Politics to comment. We'll then have some back and forth between Graham and his interlocutors, and you're in for a treat. So thank you. Graham?
So these are pretty rough times, politically speaking. If you're people who think about politics the way I do. And I want to start about talking about President Trump and threats to American democracy. But I'm probably not going to talk about the threats that you might be thinking. I'm not really going to spend time talking about the threats that might be posed by specific things that Trump might do or is doing. I'm not to say that these are not problems, although many of them are, this is what our institutions were designed to solve. Instead, I want to talk about a threat to democracy that I think seems a little thornier and harder to resolve. Because if we think, for example, that President Trump is in some way a threat to American democracy, what does that say about the voters who chose to make him president. After all, the reason Trump is president again is not because he engineered a coup or even really because of the anti-majoritarian vagaries of the Electoral College. He's president again because we had an election and he got the most votes. So, democracy, the idea, means something like a government that reflects the will of the people. And as Len said, that's an easy enough idea to be in favor of when the will of the people is the people that you like. But it's a lot harder to accept as a principle when the will of the people produces a result that, for whatever reason, seems to us deeply flawed. And it can be deeply flawed either because it represents a threat to democracy itself or simply because it produces policy outcomes that we think are really bad, like, for example, pausing all federal funding. And if any of that makes you uncomfortable, it certainly makes me uncomfortable, then you should ask, well, what could we do about it? The fact of not Trump's actions, but his election. What could we do about it without throwing away the very principle of democracy that we're trying to save, right? That government reflect the will of the people. As far as I can tell, the only solution to this problem, the only way to correct what we see as a failure of the people's reason without throwing away the very idea of popular rule, is some form of dialogue, right? If huge masses of citizens want to vote for an outcome that you think is wrong, then as far as I know, the only democratic way to prevent that outcome is to try and talk to them and give them a reason or an opportunity to change their minds. And that basic idea that dialogue in some form or another is like an essential part of the democratic process is the basis of a philosophical conception of democratic theory called deliberative democracy, which is becoming increasingly popular among political philosophers. Of course, it's also what people have been saying in like opinion pieces for the last decade or so. How many pieces have you read that say something like, we need to do a better job of listening to those we disagree with. We need to do a better job of talking outside of our bubble, right? This is not a novel idea. It's being said over and over again. The problem is it's been said over and over again. We've tried it, and it doesn't seem like it's actually working, right? And, after 8 years of people saying this, we're still divided, and Trump is president again, right? So the problem here, as I see it, the reason that political dialogue has not actually seemed to work out very well, is the same problem that I think plagues deliberative democracy, the theory, since its inception, which is that we have a very limited conception of what political dialogue actually means. So in social media and opinion pieces and in philosophical treatises about deliberative democracy, there's this generalized assumption that when we talk about the idea of political dialogue, what we're fundamentally talking about is persuasion. It's using the force of argument to try to convince people we disagree with that they're wrong and that we're right. And I think persuasion's a potentially really useful tool for democracy. I'm not knocking it. But I don't think it's well equipped to solve the problems we're facing right now. And the reason I don't think it's equipped to do that is because the main fissure in American politics right now, the thing that's dividing us, is not policy disagreements. It's not so much that we're divided as to what to do about tax policy or immigration or abortion. What's really changed recently, and this is what the political science literature says, is we've become more polarized and more hostile to Americans who come from the other political side, the other team, right? We're more polarized on identity. We're more likely to fear and hate people who are from the other team. And that's the fact that makes persuasion so difficult. Because if you think about it, imagine that you're having a debate with someone from that side. And in the course of the debate, you were asked to admit that you're wrong and they're right. What would that feel like? Would it feel good? Right? My sense is it would probably hurt quite a bit. And the literature from political psychology and social psychology In fact, in a lot of cases, it hurts so much to admit that you're wrong in front of a hated adversary that it becomes almost impossible to do it, that our brains simply prevent us from feeling that pain by forcing us to engage in motivated reasoning or other forms of cognitive bias. And that's also why our political opponents don't admit that they're wrong, even when we present them what seems like incontrovertible evidence, right? And that's why persuasion is not working, at least at scale, in the way that it needs to solve these problems. So all that seems very bad, but here's where I get very optimistic. Because it turns out that even if we disagree about who's right and who's wrong, we can still agree on what to do. So I want to give a very recent example from the ongoing kerfuffle about H-1B visas. Okay? So recently Elon Musk came out and talked about how great these visas are and caused a lot of pushback, including these are visas for quote-unquote highly skilled workers. Right? And there was pushback from Trump's orbit, but there was also pushback from Senator Bernie Sanders. And after Elon Musk came out talking about how much he loved these visas, Senator Sanders put out a press release, the title of which is something like "Elon Musk is wrong," talking about how these visas are actually a terrible idea, that they're a form of indentured servitude, and that they only benefit billionaires. So you have a very clear disagreement here, Musk and Sanders. One thinks that the visas are good, one thinks that the visas are bad. But if you dig a little deeper as to what they actually want to do about the current policy, it turns out they actually want the same thing. Both Sanders and Musk independently advocated in their critique, we need to raise the salary floor for these visas, right? So that you have to make more in order to qualify for them. Now, as far as I can tell, they want to do this for entirely different reasons. I think Musk wants to attract more highly paid programmers and engineers, and Sanders wants them to not be like indentured servitude by paying people more. But they want the same thing, even if they want it for different reasons. And really what the book is about is a form of dialogue that's aimed at finding these sorts of opportunities for agreement. Right? The form of dialogue is called integration. It was originally developed by the political philosopher and organizational theorist Mary Parker Follett way back in the early 1900s. But my argument is that this form of dialogue, making this part of what we mean when we talk about political dialogue, could help solve a lot of the problems we're facing right now. So in an integrative dialogue, the goal is you set aside the surface level disagreements, whatever the initial debate was, and you try to find the desires and concerns motivating that disagreement. Why are these people disagreeing? And then you see if there's some way to address those underlying desires and concerns in a way that is acceptable to everybody. So it's a collaborative process rather than an adversarial one. And at the end, if everything works well, everyone walks away with the underlying thing that they really wanted, but, and this is the important part, nobody has to admit that they're wrong, which is why it can work in situations where persuasion is not possible. So in the book, I discuss a number of specific examples of what this might look like in a lot of current conflicts that seem like they're zero-sum. Slavery reparations, vaccine mandates, things like that. Here I want to give another more temporarily relevant example, is debates about DEI in higher education. Right? This is a very contentious debate right now, and it's usually framed in explicitly zero-sum terms. The debate is about, is DEI good or is DEI bad? And that's the kind of debate that if you're ever going to resolve it through dialogue, the only way it gets resolved through dialogue is if one side admits that they're wrong or the other. And that doesn't seem very likely right now, for all the reasons I said. So if you wanted to try to address this through an integrative approach, what you'd do is you'd set aside that debate, the zero-sum debate about whether it's good or bad, and you'd try to ask some different questions. So first, you might ask, well, what are the specific goals that DEI initiatives are trying to achieve? There's a zillion of these, right? But for the sake of brevity, let's just pick one. One possible goal of the DEI initiative is to help faculty teach students in a way that makes sense and is useful for students from a variety of different backgrounds, including marginalized backgrounds. Now, there's probably a lot of people out there who are very strongly opposed to DEI as a concept, or even just the word, but are not necessarily opposed to that goal, as long as you can achieve it without causing other bad things. At the same time, you can ask, well, what are the specific criticisms that critics of DEI have of it? Again, there's a zillion of them, but I'll just pick one. So one common criticism of DEI is that it advances a particular, left-wing political agenda, and it's intolerant of people who don't identify as on the political left. Well, there's probably a lot of people out there who support DEI who might be at least somewhat sensitive to that concern, because it certainly seems like people who do not have progressive views on race or gender or power might be a very important target audience for a lot of these initiatives, and you probably don't want an initiative that is seen as propaganda by your target audience, right? So if that's the case, then the question you could then ask is, are there some things we could do to help faculty teach in a way that helps students from a variety of backgrounds that are not perceived, rightly or wrongly, as involving sort of left-wing political ideas? Now, I'm not saying that that's easy to figure out. It might be very difficult. But critically, it's a question you can answer without either side having to admit that they're wrong, right? And that's really the benefit of this. Now, I'm not saying this is possible in all cases. There are lots of situations in which the opposing sides, their underlying goals may be so diametrically opposed that it's not possible. But we shouldn't let that possibility prevent us from trying, okay? Partly this is because, certainly in the current political environment, in this case, this may be the best shot at actually achieving the underlying goals, okay? There may be no other way. But second, even if integration fails, just trying it can help produce a lot of benefits. There's a lot of research in terms of group contact theory that tells us that one of the best ways to reduce prejudice and divisions between groups is to have opponents work together toward a common goal in a non-adversarial setting, right? And that's what integration offers. So even if it doesn't work, it can help heal divisions. This may still sound implausible, but integration is actually already widely used. It's already widely used by some of the world's best negotiators, but behind closed doors. So if you talk to effective legislators, people like Barney Frank or Henry Waxman, and you ask them, well, how do you actually craft bipartisan agreements when they did that, they describe a process that's more or less this exact process. Now, it's not a process that plays out on the floor of the House or the Senate. It happens behind closed doors in committee rooms. But that's how they get those agreements. In terms of international diplomacy, so former EU Ambassador Stuart Eisenstadt came to Brandeis a couple months ago, and he talked about his strategies for getting agreement between groups and nations that were literally trying to kill each other. Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland, Israelis and Palestinians, and China and Taiwan. And again, he said, the approach you have to do with these groups, you're not going to persuade them that they're wrong. You have to use basically this approach, right? You search for a mutually beneficial solution. You set aside the ostensible conflict. And what I'm basically saying is we need to take integration out of the shadows, out of the committee rooms, and make it a part of how we talk about politics and policy in public, a part of what we mean when we talk about political dialogue as something we need to engage in. Now, this is not easy, right? One of the things that integration requires us is that it requires that we set aside our desire to dominate the opponent, to make them see the light and admit that they're wrong and we are correct. And that's a tough ask in a lot of situations. But what it doesn't ask us to do, it doesn't require us to compromise on our core desires. It doesn't require us to compromise on solving the underlying problem, right? And that's why it can serve as a potential way of solving these problems. We have a lot of problems: climate change, racism, inequality, the health of democracy, et cetera, et cetera. And what I'm arguing is that if we really want to prioritize solving those problems, then one effective approach in the current political moment might be setting aside our desire to dominate and to sort of win the argument, to convince our opponents that they're wrong, and engage in a process like this.
Well, thank you, Graham. We're going to we'll go in order here and take comments first from Professor Gittell. You want to stand at the podium?
I think so, yeah. Thank you so much. And for those who were at my earlier seminar, I'm sorry to be talking to you twice today, but I couldn't resist accepting this invitation. I was honored to be asked. Yeah, I'm happy to have played a role in this book by introducing Graham to Mary Parker Follett, her theory of integration in the Org Theory seminar. How many years ago?
A while, I don't know.
I don't know, but you weren't like a musician then, so it wasn't that long ago. But yeah, so I want to share briefly what I like about Follett, why I was just so excited to share that in this the seminar that we had, and I continue to. What I think is most powerful in Graham's work, and there's a lot, and what I think are the challenges that are not completely solved, and it kind of picks up where he left off just now. So what I like about Follett. So working on my dissertation, which itself was quite a long time ago, two people I look up to very much so gave me copies of her book called Mary Parker Follett, Profit of Management. I don't know if, Lisa, you can guess who one of them was. It was actually Tom Cohen. Yeah, one of my mentors, a dear friend of both of ours, and I was in his office for whatever reason. Something I said about how I was thinking about my field data inspired him to look around in his massive bookshelves and find that book and give it to me. And then when I finished my dissertation, my mother-in-law gave me that same book saying, congratulations, love, Marilyn and Irwin. So, and she's was a political scientist. So it took me a while to see how Follett informed my work on relational coordination, but now I think it's really obvious and powerful. So what I like about her, she's got an underlying relational ontology that provides insight, I think, into the human condition. And her insight is that we're creating each other all the time in every moment. We're basically constructing each other. It's a lot of responsibility to realize, but I think it's true. And using this, she provides insight into a lot of organizational or even like challenges of being a person: conflict, diversity, coordination, leadership, control, learning, and change. So let's take conflict, because it's particularly relevant to Graham's work on integrative democracy. You can solve conflict through domination, compromise, or integration. Her basic message is that integration is best because it allows us to harness the power of difference. That difference is actually a good thing because it gives us, friction, she says, is what it takes to make a car move. Friction is a very positive thing if we can harness it for good. And the benefits of difference is that we're bringing different perspectives. No one can see the whole in any reasonably complex reality. So by seeing more aspects of that reality, we can actually come up with a better solution. Therefore, conflict has the potential to be a good thing, a creative process, a way to see reality from multiple perspectives. So understanding and harnessing differences make us stronger, but it's not that easy to do. She says we need an intentional process to do it well, because difference can also be a source of unproductive conflict. And that intentional process is integration, as Graham described it beautifully. So what do I like about Graham's book? What I like is that Graham is applying these powerful ideas to democracy at a moment when democracy itself is at risk, because conflict is deep-seated. I think he makes an elegant theoretical argument that integrative democracy is not an alternative to deliberative democracy, which itself is kind of an integrative thing to do, but rather it's a type of deliberative democracy. So he's even kind of offering an integrative solution to his colleagues in the field, which I think is a good lesson to those of us who come up with an alternative theory, how to make it like part of the existing theory, rather than saying it's, you've got to give up your theory in order to like mine. So I thought that itself was a good role model. And he then argues that integrative democracy is a way to do deliberative democracy in a way that's attentive to social identity threats, as he said. And I've learned more about this from Danny Nussbaum, who's now in the doctoral, the incoming doctoral class. So that's been great. Integration means moving from persuasion to creating a new solution together, recognizing the power of different perspectives to see solutions that literally no one perspective can fully see by itself. So actually, it's not about involve people so they will feel invested in the solution, because that sometimes feels a little patronizing, but rather involve people so they can create a solution that's better in some important ways than either A or B. And if you actually believe that, it can help you go into a conversation pretty open, because you're actually curious. What do they bring that I cannot currently see? And that may help us get to a solution. So the biggest threat is my last one, the challenges that are not completely solved, in my view, and it really picks up where Graham left off. The biggest threat, as Graham acknowledges, and so does Follett, is the desire to dominate. And it reminds me that, well, first of all, even when there's an integrative solution that's actually better for everyone involved, some people may prefer domination and subordination. She said it can be a cultural thing. You know, there's that desire to dominate. It reminds me of economists who have argued people may have a taste for discrimination even when it doesn't benefit them economically. It's just like, oh, I just prefer to do that because it makes me feel better about myself. Maybe it gets back to social identity. But this was Arlie Hochschild's argument that, if I recall correctly, that Trump voters are driven by, this was the first time around, driven by emotional self-interest as much as or more than their economic self-interest. So even if you have a plan, which I believe Biden really tried hard to come up with a plan that would benefit the Trump voters, they may have an emotional self-interest in showing that group that they're wrong and we're right. So I'm not sure integrative democracy deals sufficiently with that deep-seated desire to dominate, especially when it's in retaliation for feeling disrespected, which is part of Arlie Hochschild's argument. Sincere public demonstrations of respect may be needed to get over this obstacle. I was in a board meeting last night where the board chair had people felt disrespected by a few things that had been said, and she just sincerely apologized for that. And I think it was enough that we can move on, or it's a start. But it's very hard to do. Biden tried, Harris tried, but they didn't resonate. I mean, they both did try to show respect. Respect for work, respect for the frontline worker, respect for the working person. It didn't resonate. What resonated was a promise by Trump to exact revenge and demonstrate dominance over all of those who were perceived as threats to maybe a displaced middle class, or this sense of we haven't gotten what we expected to get out of our being, you know, an American citizen or a displaced middle class. So I've heard the disrespect, actually. People calling the Midwest flyover country, and these are perfectly good, decent human beings. It's flyover country. That's kind of disrespectful to talk about, like the middle part of the entire country as flyover country, because who would want to see it? And looking down on those with uneducated accents. And maybe I noticed it a little more because I come from a family without higher education. I'm a first-generation student, so when I started college as a first-generation student, I was very attentive to passing as someone who was, you know, could be worthy of respect. But sometimes I find my own self engaging in it internally. When I, for example, I hear a Southern accent, sometimes my first reaction is, oh, they must not be that, you know, everyone's got their biases that can make other people feel disrespected. And I'm just going to end by saying we may all have some work to do. That part of what makes this integration work, in addition to coming at it in a problem-solving way rather than I'm right and you're wrong, could be to really persuade the other party, and by feeling it perhaps for real yourself, that there is a relationship of respect. So, just a thought.
Professor Lisa Lynch. You need no introduction.
She's famous.
She does need a microphone.
Yeah, you do.
No, I'll use this. I'll use this one. Good evening, everyone. Before I share a few comments on Dr. Wright's book, I first want to congratulate you, Graham, on really extraordinary read. Not the typical thing that an empirically driven economist picks up to read, but I really, over the weekend as I was finishing off the book, I actually got inspired by some of your hope. It was kind of crushed in the last 48 hours by some of the things coming out of Washington, but you did give me hope over the weekend. But, you know, as I read Dr. Wright's book, it actually immediately took me back to my own academic training and my early part of my career, where I was based in the industrial relations section at MIT Sloan School of Management. This was in the 1980s, and and actually Jody was a student, Joel was a student in the department at that time. And at that point in time, academically, we were all talking about interest-based bargaining, which is basically your integration argument. And in the practice of collective bargaining, how people approach collective bargaining was really being challenged to think of an alternative strategy in going into negotiations. And it's something that we continue to teach today here at the Heller School in our executive education program on negotiating labor agreements. So this interest-based bargaining, building off of work done by Fisher and Urey in their classic book, Getting to Yes, I just wanted to go through, how interest-based bargaining was framed. What did you need to do in order to set up the conditions to have effective interest-based bargaining? So first, you need to, or the interest-based bargaining requires that each participant respects others and their views. I'm going to go through these sort of necessary conditions, and I think then it just sort of highlights what Graham was talking about, how difficult it is at this point in time to move there. So you have to be willing to respect others and their views. Secondly, it requires a willingness to honestly do the work to find these alternative solutions, to move away from your sort of initial, whoops, the lights go off and they get dimmer. Okay. Okay, somebody's playing with the lights. So, yeah. So interest. Oh gosh, I feel like we're moving into the Twilight Zone. Yeah, that's that not only has federal funding been cut, but so has electricity. So interest-based bargaining requires this willingness to be honest, and to honestly do the work needed to have effective interest-based bargaining, to think about other ideas, to not be so wedded to your initial position. And it means to do that, you have to listen to your counterparts and your colleagues and not behave in the sort of standard hierarchy of bargaining where you would have, the one representative who would not allow anybody else in the bargaining team to say anything during the negotiations, no free flowing of ideas. If anybody disagreed, you immediately would raise your hand and say, time to caucus, leave the room, exit, have a quiet discussion outside, and then come back in with, always presenting a unified position. Interest-based bargaining is this free flow of ideas, and you never know which side is going to come up with which idea when it's really working well. And most importantly, it requires trust, and you talked about that. The stakes are high, especially in contexts where you have ideologically opposed groups that are really far apart who are meeting. And I would say, it's even harder to pull that off today when you have social media and cell phones and everything, and you can post what's happening instantaneously. And I'll just, as a side note, my own experience of being president here at Brandeis when we had a student occupation and we entered into negotiations. One of the first things that we did in the negotiations was that we imposed a communications silence zone. And we agreed that we would not either side would not communicate anything out on social media, et cetera, without agreement from the other side as we were doing the negotiations, because we knew how sort of reporting back out could have exploded the discussions. And, I actually think we incorporated a lot of this sort of interest-based bargaining or integrated approach in the deliberations that we had, which was to the good. But we also used some persuasion as well. It was a mixture of both. So So when we teach about bargaining, including when you're bargaining over policy, we talk about how bargaining involves a choice between the deal you've been offered and what you would get if you walked away from the table. I mean, that's, you know, sort of putting out those positions and framing sort of the bargaining zone. So an interest-based approach would be a search for solutions that are leaving both parties leaving that negotiation feeling that they're better off than they would be if they had reached an impasse and had gone to, okay, that's what happens if the bargaining fails. That's the outcome that you get. That's the outside option that you get. So the goal of integration, to use the words from the book, is to determine how each participant's interests could be satisfied without impeding the satisfaction of the other participant's interests. Sounds great, it's really hard to pull off. So how does this apply in the political context? I'll invoke Alexander Hamilton. I won't sing, but I will invoke Alexander Hamilton. Now, he argued that differences of opinion in the jarrings of the parties in the legislative department of the government would often promote deliberation and circumspection and serve to check excesses in the majority. So Hamilton, when he was thinking about the design of our democracy, was talking about the importance of having this dialogue across differences and this, and I think you used the same words, this kind of jarring or interaction. It's not always pleasant and let's have a cup of tea, et cetera. I mean, it can be quite intense. And what do we actually see when we watch policy making occur? I would argue that until a week ago, we basically had, as Graham has talked about, a sort of two-track policy making process, especially at the federal level. Track one is what I would call political theater. Okay, that's the public performance. And when I was working in government, when we were talking about different policy decisions and what we were going to do, we literally, this was in the Labor Department with Bob Reich, who was Secretary of Labor, we talked about the political theater and then what we were going to do behind closed doors to advance our agenda. And that was at a time in which we had a Democrat in the White House and Republican control of the Senate and the House. And we talked about how we were going to leverage political theater, persuasion, and then what we were going to do behind closed doors, the integrative approach. And in that, you know, behind closed doors, you have that much more nuanced bargaining that's happening out of the public's eyes, typically late at night. And there's some great examples. You highlighted some examples of this. The collaboration between Orrin Hatch and Ted Kennedy. Two people who ideologically could not be more opposite from one another. And yet, those two came together to work on the passage of the American Disabilities Act and on the Children's Health Insurance Protection Act. So, you know, they were able to find areas, and they actually, in the process of working on these areas of legislative mutual gains and interests, they actually became very close friends. It was really weird watching the two of them together, but they were that trust that built up between the two of them, I think, encouraged others within the Senate in particular to do a much more interest-based bargaining. Maybe we'll see this between Elizabeth Warren and Elon Musk. I mean, they are both talking about, it's a scary picture, but hang with me. I mean, they're both talking about a focus on reducing government expenditures. And I actually think there are some areas in which between the two of them, they would actually have areas of overlap, as you talked about another example with the H-1B visa. But when I think about what has happened over the last 30 years as an economist, since Hatch and Kennedy got together and were working on a whole host of really effective legislation, I think what dooms the future of interest-based bargaining in the context of politics is the concentration of economic power. and how this concentration of economic power is shaping political power. We have the emergence of super firms, a handful of firms that have complete control, or a vast majority, 70% or more, of control in the marketplace. And it's from cat food to AI technology. And that concentration of economic power really eases the ability of these very large firms to influence our politics and policy making. And never was that clearer than during the inauguration, when you look to see who was sitting in the second row. And positionality is everything in Washington, where you are, where your office is. And that image of, in the second row in the rotunda, you didn't see cabinet members, cabinet nominees, justices, foreign leaders. Instead, you saw Mark Zuckerberg, you saw Jeff Bezos, you saw Sundar Pichai, you saw Elon Musk just sitting there right in the second row. That tells you what's going on here. So what happens when the party in power does not want to engage in bargaining, doesn't want to, they see no reason to engage in persuasion or integration, as it appears to be the case today in the United States? What happens when you have a president who decides he does not need Congress and instead can use his executive power unilaterally to do whatever he needs to do? He does not have to bargain with anybody. The late, great Nobel Prize winning Daniel Kahneman talked about an angry democracy, which is a nasty world of critiques, replies, and rejoinders whose aim is to embarrass, especially in the midst of political campaigns, when the whole point is not only to win, but has been said by others, to crush and humiliate your opponent. None of this is conducive to those characteristics I talked about at the beginning that you need to have effective interest-based bargaining. And then we can throw in, as you talk about in the book, Graham, how gerrymandering has undermined the incentive to seek mutual gain solutions. So where might we expect to see integrative deliberation within our political system? I don't think we're going to see it anytime soon at the federal level. But I do think, Graham, your discussion on the role of mini publics, those sort of small, randomly selected groups of citizens who are given the role of making policy decisions, and citizen juries, is an intriguing area. And I think we have seen, and we will continue to see, pockets of that occurring at the local community level. But I think it's more likely that we'll see that being adopted in communities where there's already a well-established base of trust, and where the stakes of the decisions that are being asked to be made by this group are viewed as not being so high or so inalterable that folks would be reluctant to cede authority to such a group. Having said that, I think that Dr. Wright's discussion on the ways that protest may or may not bring about successful integrative solutions is something that we're about to see getting tested. So thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. And for the third discussion, Professor Lenowitz.
Hi, everyone. I'm super excited to be here. So I'm Jeffrey Lenowitz. I'm an associate professor in the politics department, where I focus on political theory. More specifically, I'm a democratic theorist. This means I spend basically all of my conference going and workshop time with other democratic theorists. And the literature I read and what I write is mostly about democratic theory. And deliberative democratic theory is a major part of democratic theory. Suffice it to say, I have been exposed to a lot of talks and articles and books on deliberative democratic theory. And I can honestly say, as someone who swims in these waters natively, that this is one of the most refreshing and provocative and powerful topics on the topic that I've come across in some time. I am honored that its author is one of my colleagues, though a bit jealous that apparently he also can do quantitative analysis, which I am unable to. But really, congratulations on this fantastic and deeply researched and creative book. It really is that good. Besides being a democratic theorist, I should also admit, and Graham knows this, that I am one who is skeptical of the deliberative democratic enterprise. As such, besides genuinely encouraging everyone that I know in this room and beyond to read this book, it really is that good. I'm going to serve as today's critic and hopefully raise some questions about and even push back against some of Graham's claims, all in the hopes of generating some conversation. Before doing so, I should say this is a really difficult task because he seems to have internalized almost every existing criticism on deliberative democracy, and in some sense portrays those criticisms more powerful than the original authors. So I'm going to be borrowing from this book heavily in my courses and in my lectures because you do a better job of articulating these criticisms, and in some sense the book is designed to meet them, using and leveraging Follett's theory to really plug all of the standard holes in deliberative democratic work. But I'm going to try, nonetheless. So my first set of concerns relates to the role of motivation in your account and how this interacts with a concern about power asymmetries. So the key to integration is that people involved are not trying to achieve their own ends, whatever they may be, but rather are motivated to work with others to create solutions in which everyone wins in a new, and up until the end of integration, unknown way. This requires a shift in motivation, which among other things involves a willingness of the powerful to not make use of their power asymmetries to get what they perceive as better outcomes for themselves, and a willingness of the less powerful to let go of a defensive position. But my worry is we can't predictably change motivations through institutional design, nor can we even see if actors have the right motivations at any given moment. It seems then that the integrative deliberative position relies on a transformation of motivation without a clear recipe for creating it, and mere faith that this transformation has come by the actors within it. So why and how can we rely on this? Doesn't this send the theory to the outer edges of ideal political thought, where the raw subjects of politics, people, are imagined to be different than they actually often are? Or does Follett or Graham see people as already disposed to make decisions in an integrative fashion? But if that's the case, why is it so uncommon? Or is this really supposed to work best in places where trust already exists? To kind of allude to the previous remarks. Further, concern is that actors within processes meant to be integrative also can't see motivations, and thus won't know if those they are interacting with are being sincere. This seems to place them in a prisoner's dilemma, where they risk being a sucker by adopting an integrated perspective while others are being strategic actors. In such a scenario, revealing one's most primal goals, which what is demanded by integration, right? Giving one's reservation price on the way to an integral solution would leave someone incredibly exposed. Worries such as these would seem to push political actors to resist taking this approach. So I'm sure there's an answer, but I'd like to know, how is this addressed, right? And why not instead maybe embrace something very similar, which is a conception of fair bargaining, which shares the ends of creating outcomes that satisfy as many preferences as possible, but takes as a given that people will pursue what they see as their ends. My just general question is how much does this approach, how do we distinguish it from a thick account of fair bargaining? And is really the biggest difference about the motivations of the actors themselves? Okay, so that's my first question. I'm going to skip, I think, my second one because I'm just maybe saying too much, and just go to my third, which is about mini-publics, which was just mentioned. So let's talk about application. Specifically, how can integral deliberation scale up and apply to democracy in the modern age? As Graham knows and writes about in chapter 6, which among all those good chapters is my favorite chapter, I really love it. This, in a sense, is the major question haunting deliberative democratic theory. Okay, we get all this Habermas and all this work about it, but how does this apply to politics? Give us some institutions, explain things. And a favored one are mini-publics. This is a topic of a really seemingly endless discussion in the deliberative and now the sortition literature, right? And for those who don't know, mini-publics are smaller groups of citizens, usually but not always chosen by lot, that meet to deliberate under the watchful eye of facilitators about political questions of the day and then make proposals or decisions. Now, how these mini-publics work vary, but two key things are how the sortition scheme is populated. Is it voluntary or is it mandatory like a jury? And whether the decisions of the mini-public become policy or advisory to more traditional institutional decision makers like legislatures. So there's some big classic critiques of mini-publics, and this book demolishes them. But I still have some worries. First, how would this group be selected? If the sortition mechanism was mandatory, you would likely have a lot of disinterested participants, likely unwilling to take on the weighty cognitive shift demanded by integrative deliberation. If the sortition mechanism was voluntary, if people put themselves forward to the lottery, then it probably wouldn't be representative, right? Those who volunteer to be in the lottery would be the usual bunch. Those with free time, the wealthy and the retired, and those with a high degree of political passion and interest. This would not be a body that was any way representative of the nation, but that seems to pretty severely undercut the draw of this integrative solution. Second, would the group's decisions be binding or advisory? Graham suggests that Lafont and others' criticisms about binding mini-public's decisions is correct and portrays the integrative one as making advisory opinions. But note that this highlights the previous concerns. It's hard to motivate the disinterested to participate in a process that just gives advisory opinions. Right, to get them to devote a substantial amount of time and energy to something where the actual outcome it isn't clear. My last question is about education. A key part of mini-publics is training those involved in them. Not only in the ways of discourse, or in this sense of integrative discussion, but in the factual knowledge they need to make policy decisions. This is a huge hurdle for successful mini-publics. If you know anyone who's done these things, that's a lot of their energy. How do we give people the factual information here? What I worry about is that integrated deliberation seems to require even more information, and thus would require an implausible amount of education to work. I want to consider the example Graham gives in the book. When discussing a traditional mini-public designed around choosing between two binary policy options, right, raise or lower taxes, Graham describes how an integrative mini-public might come upon a mixed solution involving closing tax loopholes, eliminating certain deductions, changing security regulations, adjusting law enforcement policies to more aggressively prosecute tax or securities fraud, and changing monetary policy to adjust interest rates. Now, unless we're imagining a mini-public of trained economists, I have a bit of worry about how this solution will be arrived at. The average citizen does not know any of the background knowledge needed to come up with really any of these creative solutions. Training people to get to this point would require probably several semesters of coursework. So I guess I have a question of, it seems that the examples of integrative solutions throughout the book, if there are many, and they're all incredibly provocative, the one about vaccines, all these things, do seem to require that the actors within them are basically absolute experts on those areas. That's how they're able to think, if they set aside their preferences, to come up with all these creative solutions and figure out things no one saw once they kind of set back their desires. But I wonder, in the course of mini-publics, how can we expect average citizens to have the kind of information needed to get to that creative solutions, given the difficulties we find on just educating people enough to discuss the binary solutions that are presented to them in traditional mini-publics? Okay, so those are just a few comments and questions I had. I had many. I have a 25-page document about all this stuff, and that's, to me, a sign of a great book, which this really is. And so thank you for rewriting it. I really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you for three really wonderful commentaries, and Graham, again, thank you for writing the book that can be the subject of our discussion. What we're going to do now is I'm going to give Graham a few minutes to respond, if you would like, to some of the questions and comments, and then give the discussants a brief opportunity to respond back, and then we'll open it to questions, and I hope we'll have 15 or 20 minutes for questions. So think of your questions and think of how to say them constructively and concisely.
Thanks. So I'm going to do this in roughly reverse order to match my recollection of how things went. So even among Jeff's comments, I'm going to kind of go in reverse order. So I do think that a lot of the challenges you raised about mini-publics are indeed pretty serious, and I'm, of the various approaches for quote-unquote scaling up deliberative democracy, I'm not super keen on mini publics as solving a lot of the problems. I devoted a lot of time to them because the literature, as you noted, spends a lot of time on them. So I felt obligated to spend a lot of time on them. And basically my argument is integrative mini publics are no more difficult or not dramatically more difficult than the deliberative kind. I think you do flag a point that in some ways they do have different requirements. And one of them, and this is a key challenge for integration in general, is one of the things that integration requires that sort of persuasion-based deliberation does not is a certain kind of creativity. And we don't know a lot about what fosters that and the skills needed to educate people on that. And that's something I think we would need to learn a lot more about. Personally, I think the more viable, large-scale ways of instantiating this idea in democracy are the sort of more abstract approaches, where this is in the Habermasian two-track model, where you don't, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. The mini-public idea is a very direct way of saying, everybody deliberate now. And I'm more interested in thinking about ways in which you could make different parts of our sort of discursive universe a little more integrative. So part of that is, thinking about the incentives for lawmakers to give them the incentive to participate in deliberation, modeling deliberation in public to help people understand that this is a viable way of talking about politics in public, not just in private. And Jody mentioned, there's different ways in which you can think about different forms of political protest as either promoting or undermining an integrative way of thinking about conflicts. And so those sorts of approaches, which are sort of not as all-encompassing as mini publics, I think it's a try a lot of different things, different areas approach, I think is more feasible. In terms of your question about motivation, so I actually think, I think Follett would agree with me, that integration is oriented in the same way as what you call fair bargaining, that it's fundamentally concerned with self-interest, that it is a very selfish mode of dialogue. And it's actually more selfish than persuasion. When we usually think about persuasion in a democratic context, we're trying to persuade you that what we're going to do is going to be good for everybody, right? That this policy will be good for the nation. And in order to accept that, you have to be willing to put the good of the nation above your good. In an integrative deliberation, what we're supposed to say is, what is it that you want, right? What do you want to accomplish? What do you need? What are you concerned about? Okay, here's what I need and what I'm concerned about. And the goal is to get you what you want while getting me what I want. And so I do think it's inherently, it's like selfish in a way that makes it more feasible, that it doesn't require a sort of more holistic motivation if it's done right. Now the challenge is, and this gets to Lisa's point, is, okay, under what circumstances would people be incentivized to do that? I think the incentives to participate in integration are really strong when you are in positions of roughly equal power and when there's no other way to get the stuff done. When the alternative to integration, or the alternative to solving a problem through dialogue is just walking away and nobody gets what they want, then I think people have a strong incentive to participate in this form of dialogue. Where you have less incentive is where you could just get what you want through non-dialectical means. You could just use statutory power or financial power or social power or cultural power to just impose your will on reality. Now, Follett makes a number of arguments that even if you could do that, it's a bad idea for a variety of reasons. One of them is that dominating your opponents, even if it works in the short term, creates resentment. And this gets to Jody's point, is that a lot of what we have seen in American politics is one side tries and to varying degrees succeeds to impose their will on the other side. And even if they succeed, the other side gets really, really mad. And so we saw, I think, one version of that with Trump's victory is that a lot of conservatives were really, really mad about their perception, right or wrong, that they had been disrespected or whatever by the left. I think now the classic American politics trajectory is thermostatics, is that when Republicans in the White House, everybody gets more liberal, and when Democrats in the White House, everyone gets more conservative. And this is one of the reasons why. And so when Trump and Republicans do a bunch of stuff, it creates resentment, even if they're able to do it, and that will show up in politics again. So, I mean, I don't think, the problem of why participate in a dialogue at all as opposed to just imposing your will on reality is a real problem for democracy. And it's not a problem for integration any more than any other kind of dialogue. So dialogue can't solve all of these problems. And there's a lot of other, this is what a lot of political institutions are designed to put curbs on people's ability to impose their will unilaterally, precisely because to give us the opportunity to have these sorts of actual solve problems through dialogue. And I will say, in regard to American politics right now, there is a lot of money and power behind the current Trump administration, which may or may not hang together. But at the end of the day, as I said, the reason that he is president is because a lot of Americans found his pitch more persuasive, for lack of a better word, than the opposing pitch in one way or another. And some of that may be mediated through money, but it was really a question about, it's really a form of dialogue. We had a dialogue in writ large about what we are dueling views of the country. And one of them was appealing to more people than other. So I do think even in a country where there's incredible concentration of power, the very fact that Trump won showed that, what people, and a lot of people who have lower levels of socioeconomic power, a lot of them, want still matters. And that, to me, suggests that, maybe not this week or next week or 2 months or even a year or 2 years from now, that in the long term, there's an opportunity for using dialogue to solve some of these problems. And finally, just on one thing that Jody pointed out, when you're thinking about integration as addressing people's underlying concerns, one thing that Follett's very clear about is you need to consider different kinds of desires and concerns. And you want to really separate, there's a substantive concerns about money or job loss or health or things, and then there's symbolic concerns about how you feel. And the reason she says you need to separate them is not because the symbolic concerns are not important. Often they're just as important. But the key is if you break them up, you don't try to solve them all at the same time. Sometimes you can do one thing to solve the symbolic concern and another thing to address the substantive concern. And often you have a situation where the disagreement between two parties is, I have this substantive concern and you have a symbolic concern. And that's the reason why it's not actually a zero sum. That sometimes when people propose a policy, it's a substantive policy that's there to make a symbolic point, to signal a certain view of the world. Other times you have a way of signaling a view of the world that has substantive implications. And one approach for integration is to try to separate those out as much as you can. And I think you saw that with a lot of Trump's executive orders, is that a lot of them they're there for symbolic purposes. They're there to signal a certain view, and they have substantive implications. But I don't think a lot of the people, I don't know how much Trump actually cares about what the substantive results are. He cares about the signal that they send and the symbolism that they have. He probably does care about some of the substantive implications. But so that's one thing to consider is separating these two kinds of interests and thinking about the ways in which you could address them differently.
Thank you. Are there comments? I would like to ask Graham a question, if that's okay. So, and Lisa, you described my own reaction to the book, A Piece of Hope at a time of despair. And what I worry about, and it goes to this motivation issue, and it goes to the symbolic issue, is that we have a president for whom winning is the goal. It's not solving the problem. It's not fixing the problem. It's not helping anybody. It's maybe staying out of jail. It's winning. I mean, his comment years ago about John McCain, that he likes winners, not people who get captured by quote unquote the enemy. And what worries me, and I'd be interested in your reaction, my moments of despair, is that he might actually be successful with some of the threats that he's issued. when Canada becomes our 51st state, or some of the other things that he's proposed and threatened, the Panama Canal being returned, that actually we're teaching people, because what a leader does is also teach people. We're teaching them that being a leader is about winning, regardless of whether you think Toronto should be part of the United States or not. And I don't know how we cope with that, and how we cope with, if you will, the educational lesson that's being passed on to the next generation.
Yeah. So I do think, integration and dialogue in general is, as you said, it's not great when you have real big asymmetries of power. And so the value I see of integration, and this is why I've started my talk this way, is it's not going to prevent Trump from doing bad things. What it offers us mainly is a hope of not having someone like him elected president again. And I think this is where, you have to lean on your political institutions for a lot of this stuff. And they exist for more or less this purpose. The reason a lot of our political institutions are what they are is because the people who designed them were worried about concentrations of power. And so they have to step up and do that. And that's sort of beyond the scope of my argument. I do think the education thing is important, that everything that we do in public about politics models how we think about politics. And Trump's modeling a certain kind of politics. I think it's going to be, and you've already started to see this, the execution is a lot messier than reality. When you actually try to get down and do these things, you will find that it turns out there's all the complexities that your critics have been talking about. It turns out some of them are real and are actually impeding your ability to do everything exactly that you want. So we'll see about that. But I think that, aside from just trying to have our political institutions do their job, the question we can ask ourselves about what should we do, one of the things we can do is to try to model, maybe the only thing or the best thing we can do is try to model an alternative vision of what politics looks like. And obviously we've been trying that, and you can see, Harris and Biden and Obama have modeled a very different version of politics than Trump. But and people in general have been doing this, and that it seems like it should have worked, but it didn't work. And I think a lot of the ways in which integration as a mode of dialogue differs from persuasion highlights the ways in which earlier articulations of sort of lefty politics were still oriented towards persuasion. And that might explain why some of them were not as effective as they might have been. And I think Jody highlighted a few of the areas in which it might be worth not compromising on our underlying concerns or desires, but thinking about even more different ways of modes of interaction and modes of dialogue. And maybe it's worth a shot is what I got.
Thank you. Any questions, or are we ready to turn to the audience? Comments? So, Ilana, if you just signal Ilana if you'd like the mic.
Maria?
Thank you, and thank you so much, Len, for organizing this panel, and Graham for writing the book that I will go over and purchase. I'm looking forward to reading it, and thanks to the comments, a lot of thought-provoking ideas shared. I have a couple of observations and then one question. My first observation is I think that you made an equivalency assumption that it was Trump's pitch, I think you used the word pitch, that distinguished his ability to win compared to Kamala Harris's pitch. And sufficient research has been done, including orchestra auditions, that the same pitch given by two different demographics would result in different outcomes. So I'm really curious about the role that race and gender plays in deliberative dialogue and how you address that as a confounding factor in your premise. So that would be the first piece, because I believe, for example, that Kamala Harris did phenomenally well given how perhaps pernicious racism and sexism and all the other isms in our society has been for centuries. Given all of that, she did phenomenally well, given that she only even started her campaign, 3 months before. So, so the pitch wasn't what I think made the difference, but that's an, uninterrogated idea on my part. We would need some analysis to know that. My other two observations, the first one is, I recommend that Heller nominate you to be the facilitator for some of the interim president's focus groups or community discussions, because you've beautifully laid out that we need to think about an integrative process, a deliberative process that may or may not view the communities in or on our campus as these, what are they called, micro-communities? What did you call those?
Mini publics.
Mini publics. And so, it should take someone like yourself to facilitate one of those mini publics, because to Jeff's point, the mini publics should either be experts in order to do a sufficient job in a short amount of time, or we have to make sure that we aren't disrespecting the participants in those many republics by saying that all opinions are informed, and if we do not respect that perspective, we're insulting them, right? So faculty or students or staff are coming into these community conversations, and we may or may not believe the veracity of their, or the quality of their input. So it's a difficult proposal that I think the interim president has given us, asking us to create these community conversations and asking us to nominate facilitators, and either assuming that they're experts or saying it's okay that they're not. So my fundamental question for all the panelists is, how would you create an approach for the university to redesign itself, given the challenge that interim Levine has given us?
Okay. So first on the
Solve the university problem.
Sure.
You got 2 minutes.
So for the election thing, so I agree that actually what I really think is, a huge portion of actually the result of the election was pre-baked economic stuff, is inflation and stuff, and that like any random Democrat and any random Republican would have had a very similar situation. I think the surprising thing about Trump's, what I say, pitch is, it's not that it worked, but that it didn't not work, right? That you might have expected in a sort of normal universe, someone who said all the things that he said to people say like, I'm worried about inflation, but that's crazy. And that didn't happen. And not only did it not happen, that Trump's vote share among non-white voters seemed to go up. Now, I don't know why that is, and it's still not a majority, but I think what it speaks to is, so everything that everybody does in politics is filtered through all this structural stuff, through race, gender, politics, ideology, whatever. And that's part of how everybody perceives everything. And so, I do spend a lot of time in the book talking about the various ways in which different kinds of power inequalities, including power inequalities related to race, have implications for deliberation, for integration. One of the things that I like about integration is, in contrast to persuasion, because there's no winners and losers, you don't have to worry so much about, in a dialogue, there's some people who have more power than others. In a normal persuasion-based deliberation, you should really worry that the people who have the pre-existing, training in being persuasive, who have the background in that, are just going to run roughshod over other people. But in an integrative deliberation, where the first question is, okay, what do you want? What do I want? Let's see if we can get something that we both like. That's a little less of a concern. So I do think that, the election's very complicated and there's a lot of structural factors, and they're probably more important than the specific things that were said on the campaign trail. But I think, for me, the surprising thing about Trump is that his rhetoric didn't disqualify him in a lot of voters' minds in the way that, it seemed like it should have for me. And wrestling with the implications for democracy is why? Why did people still think, I'm still going to vote for this guy? And that's a tough question. And I think I don't have like a brilliant answer to it, and there's probably a lot of them, but that's sort of the starting point for me is where we get there. And we'll talk about the university thing. I'm happy to be to be in dialogue about that. I got no brilliant ideas right now. So.
Okay, other questions? Janet.
So I also have not read your book yet. I will, promise. So I don't, it's a little hard to respond to everything I've heard, but this idea of these mini publics really interests me because I'm wondering if these are ideas that are applicable to small groups, I'm thinking of, I live in a town that has town meeting, and I just love that because it's like, oh, this is democracy. And I think that a lot of these, what you're describing, how applicable it would be for that kind of setting, where there probably is more of a shared understanding of the goals. We want a nice town. We have different ideas of what a nice town would look like, but we share something. And we want to have lower taxes, but we want all the services. There's a shared sense like we are all dealing with that same tension, and we might come to a different decision. So just a sense of shared understanding that it's really hard to imagine on a national presidential election scale.
Yeah. So first of all, I think the general idea of mini publics is that the process of in-person deliberation, whether it's through integration or persuasion, gets more unwieldy the bigger the group gets. And a lot of deliberative Democrats will basically say, like, a town meeting is too big. Like, it's too unwieldy to have really robust deliberation. That's why the mini publics are usually smaller. That being said, I think you're right, and I think Lisa spoke to this too, that the prospects for this, or really deliberation in general, are sort of much more rosy at local levels, and they get more contentious as you go up. And the reason they get tension as you go up is because everything gets filtered through these sort of national identity politics opposition. So I think there's a case to be made at starting at the bottom level and sort of moving up from there, because a lot of times, a lot of the incentives for higher level politics are built at lower levels, right? The incentives for congressional representatives in the US Congress are formed based on their district and the voting procedure of their state, which is chosen at the state level, right? And the incentives for the state legislators is often, is also chosen at the state level. And so there's some of the prospects for electoral reform have basically leveraged that process, that changing the way Congress works by changing state policy about, for example, primary elections and things like that. So that I think that's what some deliberative theorists would call a sort of indirect approach to deliberative democracy. There's things that you're doing that are not people talking to each other that facilitate better deliberation at higher levels.
At one point in time, we had this quaint idea, e pluribus unum, but I think that's a long time ago. Yes? Could you just identify yourself when you speak?
Yes, my name is Scott Schwartz. And, I understand how people don't want to admit they're wrong in front of another individual. There's been research how people feel being wrong in front of an artificial intelligence engine? Like, for example, you present your argument to ChatGPT, I present my argument to ChatGPT. How do you feel if that machine says that you are wrong?
So I actually think it's significantly worse than that, that it's even hard to admit that you're wrong to yourself, without anybody in public at all. And so, and this is the sort of, what the research tells us is, this doesn't always happen, but it's easy for me to admit I'm wrong about some things, right? It's harder for me to admit that I'm wrong about things that are a core part of my sense of self and self-worth, right? So like admitting that, I, made some random decision about, what piece of pizza to eat or something, like that doesn't cause me a problem. But like, if I had to admit that like the entire discipline of political philosophy is bogus, that would be really hard for me because it would suggest that I've been wasting a lot of my time, that part of the reason I think of myself as a worthwhile and good person is because I participate in this thing that I have value. And when trying to admit you're wrong about something like that, that's called social identity threat, that's where it gets so painful that it's not even that we're not willing to admit that we're wrong, like vocally. They're like, I know I'm wrong, but I don't want to say it. What really happens is, whether we like it or not, our brains kick in this defense mechanism. And it's the same kind of thing that, if you get an injury, your brain sends some endorphins or adrenaline into you to help you get away from the saber-toothed tiger or whatever. It's the same process to prevent you from the cognitive harm of having to admit, my entire life has been a lie. Your brain says, you don't have to think about that. You don't have to admit that. I know that would be too painful. I will give you some sort of rationalization for you to not have to think that. And that happens unconsciously. And you can study this. And no matter how much you teach someone about cognitive biases, it still happens to them. And so it might be that it's easier to admit that you're wrong in front of an AI than a real hated opponent. But the real problem that we have is it's so hard to admit that you're wrong. Even just the concept of, it's not that I'm admitting I'm wrong in front of a Republican, but admitting to myself that a Republican might be right about something, even if it's just to myself, is a threat to my sense of self if I define my self-worth as I'm part of the good guys and they're the bad guys, right? So that's, I think, the much deeper problem that hurts persuasion.
Great. Any additional questions? Any comments from discussants?
That last one really resonated because I think that's why I said if you're going to respect the other, it's got to be sincere, not just because they can tell if it's not, but if you don't truly respect them, then you're still in that identity space where you can't be wrong because you so deeply disrespect the other. So it's respecting the other almost creates a space of psychological safety for the conversation to even happen and to create a broader social identity beyond the one that is holding everybody back. You asked before, I think, a really interesting question. Well, creativity is a really important part of being able to do integration. And one of the things I found from creativity research, it kind of reminds me of this whole neurological fight or flight thing. Fight or flight, sense of threat, is one of the things that really shuts down creativity. Fight or flight activates a different part of the brain. It's not the creative part. So it's the respect that enables psychological safety, which allows ideas to just be shared and be thought of and to create that space. So there is something, not to get too much into respect, but it actually creates both a potential for a shared identity and a potential for that creative thinking, which gets a little bit to that problem of knowledge, because is it the experts? We need some experts for sure, but we also need people to share what they know, their lived experience. And that's the kind of thing that can come out of a creative process that might suggest a creative solution, even if they're not like a rocket scientist. Yeah. I guess one last thing is that the motivation thing, like why would you engage in something if you are so powerful, especially at the local and state level, but I think it can happen even at the global level at this point. Even if you're the most powerful person on the planet, there's some things you can't accomplish because of interdependence. So when there's an interdependence but then more importantly, recognition that you need the other to get what you really want, it takes power a little bit out of the equation and gets you maybe to the table.
But I think that's why and Jeff, you talked about this in your comments, that sort of the structure that surrounds the policymaking, what are those institutions, rule of law, are so important. You talk in your book, for example, about gerrymandering. So what does that do? By gerrymandering, you're now constructing a political district for a representative where they don't have to work so hard. I mean, it's pretty clear what it is that they have to do because everybody's sort of the same mind. And so in terms of achieving their interest, right, it's just to do, what everybody has basically agreed to with respect to how the district was designed. When you have a district that's much more heterogeneous, then you're putting much more pressure on their representative to kind of figure out a third way or an alternative route and to have an incentive to actually go behind the closed doors and come up with a solution that generates returns for the district as a whole. So as we let go of those structures, and I mean, gerrymandering has been done by Republicans and Democrats, so it's not like it's one side or the other. I mean, everybody's all in this together. But, things like gerrymandering, the process of selection of the judges, all of those barriers that were put up to try to create some, at least speed bumps to, one part of government taking off, like what we're seeing right now. We didn't pay attention to that. We lost sight of that. And as that stuff got whittled away, then we shouldn't be surprised then when we get ourselves to the point where we are now.
Well, thank you. And we're at the time for deliberating over food, also known as schmoozing and eating. So I want to thank Graham again for a provocative and wonderful book that's helped us think about the situation that we're in. And I want to thank Jody, Lisa, and Jeff for being wonderful, wonderful discussants. Thank you all.